She stood before a king who chose a crown over a child he'd never know he had. He called her weak. He called her unworthy. He placed the royal crown on another woman's head while his true Luna carried his only heir in secret. But here's what no one in that throne room understood. The most dangerous thing in any kingdom isn't the wolf who roars the loudest. It's the one who walks away in silence and never looks back. Stay until the end. Hit like if you believe she deserved better. And drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. The torches along the Great Hall burned low that night, their light the color of old blood, casting everything in shades that made even beautiful things look like wounds. Evelyn Ashford stood at the far end of the ceremonial corridor, alone except for her own reflection in the polished obsidian wall beside her. She had not eaten since morning. Her hands were cold, not from the mountain air that knifed through the stone archways of Dusk Hollow Palace. She had lived through worse winters, but from something she'd swallowed down and refused to name since the moment she'd pressed two trembling fingers to her own wrist and felt a second pulse drumming there, faint and furious and entirely its own. 6 hours ago, she had been sitting on the edge of the copper basin in her chambers, staring at the midwife's face, watching the woman's expression shift from professional neutral into something careful and congratulatory, and Evelyn had felt the ground move beneath her feet, even though she was sitting still. "Your Luna," the midwife had said, in a voice like someone handing over a flame and hoping you didn't drop it, "is with child." Evelyn hadn't answered. She'd sat there until the midwife left, and then she'd pressed her palm flat against her own stomach and thought, tonight is the moon crown ceremony. Tonight Kaelin names his queen. She had known, in the way that women who have loved difficult men always know before they know, that something was wrong. She had known it in the way Kaelin stopped reaching for her in the dark, in the way Celine's laughter found him in rooms that used to be quiet, in the way her own name had started to feel like something he was embarrassed to carry in his mouth. But she had told herself, he is under pressure. The rival packs are moving. The northern border bled again last month. Men like Kaelin go cold before they come back. She had told herself a lot of things. Now she stood in the corridor in a gown the color of winter ash, her dark hair pinned back with a crown braid that 3 palace women had spent 2 hours constructing, and she pressed one hand against the obsidian wall and let the cold stone hold her up for a moment. You can tell him after, she thought, after the ceremony. You can take his hand and lead him somewhere private, and you can say, Kaelin, there is something I need you to know. She straightened her spine, rolled her shoulders back, walked toward the sound of drums. The Great Hall of Dusk Hollow Palace held 400 warriors, 47 noble families, and more politics per square foot than any battlefield Evelyn had ever seen. The ceiling vaulted 30 feet above their heads, and the moon crest, carved in silver and volcanic stone, dominated the wall behind the throne like a second sun. The entire kingdom turned out for the moon crown ceremony. It happened once per reign. You did not miss it. Evelyn slipped into the hall through the side archway, the one reserved for the Luna's entry. 2 guards flanked her automatically. She acknowledged them with a nod and nothing else, because her throat had sealed itself shut somewhere between the corridor and this room, and she did not trust what might come out of it. The crowd parted as she moved, not dramatically, just the small physical negotiations of people who knew what she was and what tonight meant. She was Luna Designate. She had been Kaelin's mate since the night 3 years ago when the bond had snapped into place between them like a lock finding its key, sudden and complete and beyond either of their choosing. That was how it worked among their kind. The bond was not a feeling. It was a fact. She found her place beside the ceremonial steps and stood there with her hands loose at her sides, watching the dais. Kaelin was already there. He stood with his back half turned, speaking quietly with one of his commanders. And Evelyn allowed herself a single full look at him the way she rarely permitted herself anymore. The width of his shoulders under the formal black war coat, the silver chain of alpha rank across his chest, the jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the walls around him. She had memorized every angle of that face in the dark. She knew the sound of his breathing when he was asleep. She knew the way his hands moved when he was planning something and trying not to show it. She did not know who he was tonight. Then he turned and his eyes found hers across the hall, and she saw it. That fractional pause, that almost flinch, and her stomach dropped 6 floors. He knows I'm here, she thought, and he wishes I wasn't. She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still. It was the first skill any woman learned in a palace full of men who read weakness like a language. Chan. The ceremony began with the drum beats, 3 long rolls that shook the candle flames in their iron fixtures. Evelyn watched the High Elder, a gray-bearded wolf named Aldrich, who had served 4 kings and outlasted most of what they'd built, ascend the dais with the moon crown carried on a cushion of midnight velvet. The crown was not large. That was always what struck people who saw it for the first time. They expected something enormous, something that announced itself. Instead, it was a narrow circlet of silver and dark wood, etched with the old markings, the ones that predated written language. It was the weight of it that mattered, the symbolic gravity. Whoever wore it stood not just beside the king, but inside the covenant, bound to the pack's survival, the bloodline's continuity, the unwritten contract between ruler and ruled. Aldrich's voice carried across the hall without effort. By the law of the moon and the covenant of blood, he intoned, the Alpha King presents before his people the one he has chosen to stand as Luna, to carry the crown, and to bind her fate to the fate of this throne. 400 people went perfectly, comprehensively silent. Evelyn breathed in through her nose. She could smell her own heartbeat, iron and adrenaline, that specific cocktail her body produced when it was preparing for something it didn't yet have a name for. He will call my name, she told herself. Whatever else is wrong, he will call my name. I carry his heir. The bond is real. I am standing here. Kaelin turned to face the hall. And then he looked, not at Evelyn, but to the right side of the dais, where a woman in crimson stood with her chin lifted and her copper hair loose down her back, and Evelyn watched his expression do something she had never seen it do before. It softened. Not the softening of a man who loves with his whole chest, the softening of a man who has already decided and is relieved that the deciding is over. I name, Kaelin said, and his voice filled the hall the way it always did. No effort, no performance, just raw authority. Selene of the Crimson House as Luna of Dusk Hollow, as the one who will carry my crown and stand beside my throne. The silence afterward was the kind that has a texture. You could put your hand out and touch it. Aldrich moved toward Selene. Evelyn did not move. She was not sure, in that first moment, whether her body had received the information yet. Her feet stayed where they were. Her hands stayed loose at her sides. Her face stayed still. She was very, very good at keeping her face still. But somewhere beneath her ribs, in the place where the mate bond lived, that cord of heat and recognition that had been there since the night it formed, she felt something give. Not break. Not yet. Just give. The way ice gives before it shatters, that first underwater groan of structural failure that no one above the surface can hear. Around her, the hall began to buzz. She could hear it in fragments, voices cutting under each other, the rustle of formal wear as people turned to look at her, the particular silence of 400 people deciding whether to acknowledge what was happening or pretend they hadn't seen. She stared at the dais. She stared at Kaelin, placing the moon crown, her crown, the crown that bore the weight of everything she had endured and survived and prepared herself to carry, onto Selene's copper hair. She stared at the way Selene's chin lifted higher as it settled, the proprietary satisfaction in her jaw, the small performance of humility on her face that was not humility at all. She stared at Kaelin, who had still not looked at her again. Suck. He looked at her eventually. He had to. 400 witnesses made avoidance impossible past a certain point, and Kaelin, whatever else he was not a coward in the simple physical sense. He turned and found her in the crowd, and the look on his face was the most devastating thing Evelyn had ever seen on another person's face, because it was not cruel. It was not even cold. It was resolved. He had decided. He had decided before he walked into this room, before he put on the war coat, before the drums started. He had looked at whatever equation he'd been running in that calculating king's mind of his, and he had arrived at an answer that did not include her, and he had made his peace with it, and now he was standing there with the look of a man who had already moved on to the next problem. That was what broke her. Not the anger, not the contempt, the absence of anguish. He did not look like a man destroying something precious. He looked like a man setting down a load he'd been carrying too long. Aldrich's voice cut through the hall again, and Evelyn realized the old man was speaking in her direction. "The former Luna designate," Aldrich said, with the careful neutrality of a man threading between protocol and catastrophe, "will be shown to the—" "She's not the Luna designate anymore." Kalen's voice. Flat, certain. The voice he used for troop movements and land disputes. "She hasn't been for some time." Evelyn heard the intake of breath from the people nearest to her. She heard someone, a noblewoman, she thought, from the House of Greymere, make a small involuntary sound. She made no sound. She looked at Kalen, and Kalen looked at her, and the space between them was full of 3 years and one secret she was still carrying in her body, and she thought, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, "He is never going to know. I am going to walk out of this room, and he is never going to know." "You have something to say." He said it not as a question. He said it the way he said everything, as a statement of fact, waiting to be confirmed or denied. The hall was absolutely still. Evelyn took a breath. "No," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "I don't." Something moved behind his eyes. Something quick and immediately suppressed. Something that might have been guilt if he'd allowed it to develop into guilt instead of converting it, the way he converted everything into certainty. "You were never suited for this, Evelyn. You have to know that. The kingdom needs strength, not don't." She said it quietly, not as a plea, as a line. He stopped. Not because the words stopped him. Kalen did not stop for words. He stopped because her tone had something in it he hadn't heard from her before. Something that was not grief or devastation, but was something older and colder and more final. "I'm not going to stand here," she said, still quiet, still level, "and let you explain it to me. In front of them." Her eyes moved, the smallest gesture, across the watching hall. "You made your choice. That's your right. I'm done." She turned. She walked. 400 people watched her go, and not one of them said a word. She made it to the corridor outside the east wing before her knees went. Not all the way down. She caught herself on the stone wall, both palms flat against it, the cold biting through her skin, and she stood there for 30 seconds in the dark with her forehead pressed against the stone and her eyes closed and her whole body shaking with the effort of not making any sound. "Don't," she told herself. "Not here. Not yet." The stone smelled like mineral water and old torches, and the specific dust of a palace that had been built to last centuries. She pressed harder against it, like she was trying to transfer the wall's indifference into her own chest, and she breathed, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, the way her mother had taught her before her mother had stopped being someone who could teach her anything. The second pulse was still there, faint and furious and entirely its own. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, over the ash-colored gown. "That's you," she thought, and her voice inside her own skull came out strange. Not grief-strange, but something fiercer and rawer, something she recognized after a moment as ferocity. "That's you, and that's me, and we are done here." She straightened up. Her face was still dry. She registered that with dim surprise. She had not cried. She was not sure if that was strength or shock, and she decided it didn't matter. She pushed off the wall and turned down the corridor, moving now with direction and purpose, and she began doing in her mind what she'd always been good at when things collapsed. Inventory. What did she have? What did she need? How much time before Kalen's people started paying attention to where she'd gone? She cataloged quickly and without sentiment, 300 silver coins she'd squirreled into a cedar box beneath the loose floor plank in her chambers, because she'd always believed in keeping an exit she hadn't announced to anyone. She had the traveling clothes she'd brought from her home pack 3 years ago, rough spun and dark, good for mountains. She had a horse she'd been training herself for 6 months because she liked horses, and also because she trusted animals more than courts. And she pressed her palm against her stomach again, briefly. She had this. "We go north," she decided. The northern packs were outside Kalen's direct authority, clustered in the mountain territories where governance was loose and grudges ran deep and strangers were left alone if they arrived without banners. She had contacts there, loose ones. The kind of contacts that came from being the daughter of a border house alpha before she'd been anything else. We go north, and we don't come back. The decision dropped into place with the clean finality of something inevitable, not the finality of surrender, the finality of choosing your own ground. She was not quiet enough. Or perhaps Mira, her personal attendant, a sharp-eyed girl from the eastern villages who had served Evelyn with a terrifying efficiency for 2 years, had simply been watching the corridor. Mira appeared from the shadows beside Evelyn's chamber door with the particular silent quality of someone who had been waiting. My lady. The title came out careful, loaded. Don't, Evelyn said for the second time in one night. I heard. Mira's voice was flat and careful and very controlled. Everyone heard. Then you know I'm busy. You're packing. Mira said it not as an accusation, but as a fact she was laying down to establish that she wasn't being misled. Evelyn pushed open her chamber door and Mira followed her inside without waiting for permission, which was typical of Mira, and Evelyn had never once objected because she'd always valued the girl's lack of ceremony more than she'd valued her own privacy. The chamber was as she'd left it, firelight, the copper basin, the cedar box under the floor plank. She went to the wardrobe first. Where? Mira asked. North. The mountain territories. A beat. Alone. Yes. Mira was quiet for a moment. Evelyn could hear her thinking. The specific quality of Mira's silences had always been audible, dense with calculation. You're not just leaving because of tonight, Mira said finally. Evelyn pulled the rough-spun riding clothes from the back of the wardrobe, the ones she'd buried under formal gowns and never worn since she'd arrived in this palace. They smelled faintly of cedar and the old life she'd come from. No, she said. I'm not. She heard Mira's breath change, not dramatically, just that small adjustment that meant the girl had added something up and arrived at an answer. Mira was perceptive in ways that sometimes felt supernatural and were probably just the result of watching powerful people closely for years. How long? Mira asked. Evelyn looked at her. The firelight was warm and Mira's face was 22 years old and entirely without guile, and Evelyn felt a sudden fierce tenderness that she immediately compressed down into something workable. I don't know, she said. Early enough that there's nothing to show yet. Mira nodded, not stunned, not horrified, just absorbing it, the way she absorbed everything, with that particular practical grace. Then she said, Does he? No. Are you going to? No. Mira was quiet. He called me weak, Evelyn said. She wasn't sure why she said it. She'd been so careful all night about what came out of her mouth. Maybe it was the chamber, the familiarity of it, the small privacy. In front of 47 noble houses and 400 warriors, he said I was unworthy of carrying the future of the throne. Her voice stayed level. So I'm going to carry the future of the throne out of here in my own body, and he is never going to know. The fire popped. Shadows moved. Mira walked to the wardrobe, opened the bottom drawer, and began methodically selecting items with the focused efficiency of someone doing the most important thing they've ever done. I'm coming with you, she said. No. Yes. Mira. You'll need someone who can talk to midwives without panicking. The girl didn't look up from the drawer. You'll need someone who can source food and blankets in mountain packs without asking questions that draw attention. And you'll need... She paused, something stiffening in her shoulder, something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it. You'll need someone. As Evelyn stood in the center of her chamber in the ash-colored gown that 3 women had spent 2 hours constructing, and she looked at this girl who had appeared in her life as a servant and become something she didn't have a clean word for, and she said, If you come with me, you give up everything you have here. What do I have here? Mira said it without inflection, not a question. Evelyn didn't answer, because Mira's family was 3 days' ride east and Mira had been sent to palace service at 15, and the palace had been her world for 7 years, and if Kaylin ever decided to use her as leverage... Get the cedar box, Evelyn said. under the south floor plank. Mira moved. They left before the ceremony fires had burned down to coal. Evelyn wrote one note. Not to Kaylin. She had nothing to say to Kaylin, nothing that would survive the journey from her chest to paper without becoming something she was not ready to become. She wrote to Aldrich. The High Elder, who had performed 4 ceremonies and outlasted 4 kings, who had looked at her tonight with an expression she'd read as carefully maintained neutrality, and now reread, from the distance of a horse's back in a dark mountain road, as something that might have been apology. The note said only, "What you witnessed tonight was not a beginning, it was a consequence. The wolves who rule by pride instead of covenant do not build kingdoms. They burn them." She folded it once and left it on the empty bed, pinned beneath her wedding ring, which she set down with the deliberateness of someone completing a transaction. Then she and Mira rode north into the dark. She did not look back at the palace. She told herself it was because looking back was a waste of time and motion, and in the mountain dark with no escort and a horse under her that she'd trained herself and a body that was quietly remaking itself around a second heartbeat, efficiency was survival. She told herself that. But the truth she pressed down and labeled and stored away somewhere she could get to later if she needed to, the way she'd always handled the truths that were too large for immediate use, was that she was afraid if she looked back at those torch-lit towers, she would feel something that would make North impossible. That she would feel the mate bond pulling like a fishhook through the sternum, the way it sometimes did when she'd been too long away from him. And she would turn the horse and go back, and she would tell him, and she would watch him do the calculation, and she would see on his face whether a child was an inconvenience or a revelation, and she was not ready for either answer. She kept her eyes on the road. The mountains at night were black and massive and entirely indifferent. The cold came down off them in waves that got into the gaps of her riding coat and reminded her body that comfort was a borrowed thing, available only in territories you'd fought to secure. She had grown up near mountains like these. She knew what they asked of you. Everything, they said. Pay everything and we might let you pass. How fast can we ride before you need to stop? Mira asked, from half a length behind her. Same pace as you, Evelyn said. That's not an answer. I'm fine. You've been fine for about 6 hours in a row now, Mira said, with the particular dryness she deployed when she was worried and didn't want to be obvious about it. That's a very long time to be fine. Mira, my lady, ride. They rode. 3 miles out from the palace gates, the road curved northeast, and the last of Dusk Hollow's lights dropped below the ridgeline, and Evelyn felt the precise moment when the mate bond stretched thin, the way it went from warm to taut to something that vibrated at a frequency just below pain, like a string pulled past its proper tension. She breathed through it. It would ease when the distance became real distance, when enough miles got between her and the palace. She knew how the bond worked. She'd studied it the way she'd studied everything she hadn't chosen but had been given, carefully, without sentimentality, to understand its limits. The bond could not compel her. It could not command her back. It was not a leash, whatever Kaylin might have preferred. It was a signal. And right now, the signal was screaming because she was moving in the wrong direction from everything it had been oriented toward for 3 years. Good, she thought, with a savagery that surprised her. Scream. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, one quick touch, a check-in. Still there. Both pulses. We're moving, she told the second one silently. We're going north. It's cold and it's going to get worse before it gets better. She thought she felt something. Not literally, not yet. It was too early for that. But some answering warmth, some small, stubborn gravity of presence. And she clenched her jaw and kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. They made it 15 miles before Mira said anything else worth remembering, and by then the road had narrowed from a proper trade route to a packed dirt path with winter grass pushing through the edges, and the mountains had gone from massive to intimate, the peaks close enough that Evelyn could see the snow line above them, pale against the black sky. They'll send someone to look for you, Mira said. Eventually. How long do you think before they notice you're gone? Evelyn considered. Kaylin will be managing Celine tonight. Aldrich will have his hands full with the nobles. The guards change at dawn. She ran the numbers without emotion, the way her father had taught her to run numbers before a border dispute. Strip the feelings out of it. Look at the logistics bare. 4 hours, maybe 5 before anyone thinks to check the chamber. Another 2 before they confirm I'm gone rather than hiding somewhere on the grounds. Then we have until morning. We have until morning. Mira was quiet again. Then, he doesn't deserve to know. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really directed at Evelyn. It had the quality of something the girl was saying out loud to hear whether she believed it. Evelyn didn't answer, because that was the question that could hollow her out if she let it breathe, and she couldn't afford to be hollow. Not tonight. Not with this road and these mountains and everything that came after. Whether Kaylin deserved to know was not the point. The point was what knowing would mean. The point was that a child born to the throne of Dusk Hollow was a political fact as much as a human one. The point was that Celine, copper-haired, calculating Celine, who had been angling for the crown for longer than anyone had been watching, would understand immediately what an heir meant for her new position. The point was that the safest child in the world was the one no one knew existed. Especially, she thought, not the man who just taught me exactly how expendable love is when power calls. The road curved again, angling hard toward the tree line, and somewhere in the dark ahead an owl called once and went silent. She was 2 miles from the first mountain pass when she heard the sound. She heard it before Mira did. That was the wolf in her, the instinct that ran beneath the thinking and the planning and the grief, the animal layer that registered threat as a physical sensation before the mind could name it. She heard the hoofbeats, not coming from behind her from the palace road, coming from the side, from the eastern tree line where no road ran and no honest traveler went. Her horse shied. She brought it under control with her knees and her weight, automatic and wordless, and in the same motion her hand went to the short blade she wore strapped beneath her riding coat, the one Kaylin had never known about because she'd never told him, because she'd always believed in keeping an exit she hadn't announced to anyone. Mira. Her voice came out quiet and hard. Stop your horse. Mira stopped. The tree line was 30 feet to the east. The hoofbeats had stopped when she stopped, which meant whoever it was had been matching her pace, not approaching. Paralleling. Watching, she thought. Following. Her mind ran the possibilities fast. A patrol? Kaylin's people wouldn't have reached her yet, not on this road, not this quickly, unless someone had already known she would leave tonight, unless someone had been watching her specifically, not as a consequence of her departure, but before it. Celine. The thought landed with the cold weight of something she should have seen coming. She pressed her heels into her horse's flanks, and the animal surged forward, and behind her she heard Mira's horse follow, and from the tree line she heard the hoofbeats resume, no longer matching her pace. Closing. She rode harder. 3 riders broke from the trees, and even in the darkness she could see the red mark on the lead rider's wrist. Not a house crest, not a military insignia, but the crimson mark, Celine's personal sigil, the one her private guard wore. She sent them before the ceremony was over, Evelyn realized. She didn't know I was leaving. She was going to do this regardless. The lead rider raised something, and Evelyn dropped flat against her horse's neck, and the sound that cracked through the mountain dark was not hoofbeats or wind, but something smaller and more precise, and she heard Mira shout her name, and Evelyn's horse screamed and went down. She hit the ground hard, shoulder first, and rolled the way her father had drilled into her on the training fields of her home pack, and came up bleeding from her palm and breathing hard and already moving, because the ground was not a place you stayed, not when there were 3 riders and only 2 of you. She got her feet under her, she got her blade out, and in the cold mountain dark, 3 miles from a palace that no longer held anything she was going back to, Evelyn Ashford looked at the 3 figures closing in on her through the dark. Not soldiers, not a search party, but assassins wearing the mark of the woman who now wore her crown, and understood, with the absolute clarity of an animal backed against a cliff face, that Celine had never wanted the throne alone. She wanted the only thing that could ever threaten it gone first. The horse was still screaming when Evelyn got to her feet. Not a death sound. She registered that in the first half-second the animal's leg was down, but the panic in its voice was pain and shock, not the final quiet that came after. She filed that away because she was a practical woman and a horse was a living tool and tools mattered. But she filed it behind the more urgent information, which was that 3 riders had closed to 20 feet and the lead one was already off his mount with a blade in his hand. She knew what she was looking at. She'd grown up watching her father train his border guards. These were not soldiers following orders. Soldiers had posture, hesitation, the specific reluctance of men who killed because they were told to. These three moved the way men moved when killing was their actual work: economical, unhurried, already calculating exits. Celine planned this before the ceremony ended, she thought again, and the thought had a different texture now that she was standing in road dirt with blood running off her palm. Which means she planned it before she knew I'd run. That meant this wasn't a response, it was a standing order. Find the Luna designate, make sure she stops being a problem. She'd underestimated how much Celine had thought ahead. That was the last time she'd make that mistake. The lead man was maybe 6 feet, broad through the chest, and he held his blade low and easy, the grip of someone who'd done this enough times that nerves were no longer part of the equation. He looked at her the way people looked at administrative tasks. "Come quiet," he said. His accent was South Border. "Less mess." "Where's the fun in that?" Evelyn said. He moved. She had been trained by her father, who had believed very strongly that a border house alpha's daughter should be able to bleed a man before he expected it. She was smaller than this man by about 80 pounds, and she knew it and she used it, going under his first swing instead of trying to meet it, getting inside his reach where the blade was useless, and she wasn't, and she put her shorter blade into the meat of his forearm before he could adjust. He didn't go down. She hadn't expected him to. She'd expected him to be angry, and he was, and she was already moving. "Mira," she called without looking back. "Tree line, go!" "I'm not—" That was not a request. She heard Mira's horse moving, and she did not have time to track whether it was moving in the right direction because the second rider was off his horse now, and the first man was angry and bleeding and reconsidering the pace of this. 2 against 1. She'd had worse odds in training, never in the field. "You've never been in the field," some honest part of her said. "You are now," she answered. Hummucked. She bought herself 90 seconds by being fast and dirty and completely uninterested in anything except not dying, and at the end of 90 seconds she had a cut along her left forearm that she wasn't thinking about yet, and the first man had stopped chasing her because she'd taken his knee, and the second man was between her and the trees, and the third was still mounted. The mounted one was the problem. A mounted fighter against a woman on foot in mountain dark was not a fight. It was a conclusion. She heard hoofbeats from the tree line, not the third rider, different cadence, and then a sound that was specifically the sound of something large and heavy connecting with something else large and heavy, and she spun to see the third rider's horse rearing, spooked by something in the dark. A voice came from the trees. "You want to keep going, or you want to take the deal?" Male. Low. The accent was northern, not Dusk Hollow north, but the farther north, the mountain pack north, where the consonants got harder and the vowels dried out. The mounted rider brought his horse under control and turned toward the voice. "Who the hells are you?" "Someone who watched you follow these women for 4 miles and thought you looked lost." A pause. "I'll take that as no deal." What came next happened fast. She heard movement in the dark that she couldn't fully track, heard the third rider curse in a high-pitched way that suggested pain, and then the man was on the ground and his horse was gone, and the 2 on foot were looking at the trees with the specific recalculation of men who had decided this job was no longer worth the wage. The one she'd cut in the arm made the decision first. He grabbed the second man's sleeve and pulled, and they moved south at a pace that was not quite running, because running was an acknowledgement of fear, and these men didn't acknowledge fear, but it was rapid and it was not toward her. She stood in the road with blood on her arm and dirt on her gown, and her blade in her hand, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. From the trees, the sound of someone on foot moving toward her, unhurried. Her blade stayed up. A man stepped onto the road. He was tall, not Kalen's cathedral wall breadth, but the lean, deliberate height of someone who'd grown up in altitude, where everything was harder and the bodies that survived were the ones that wasted nothing. Dark clothing. No insignia she recognized. He was maybe 30, maybe 35, with a face that had been hit before and hadn't particularly cared about the consequences. And he was looking at her blade with an expression that was not threat assessment, but something closer to professional appreciation. "You want to put that down?" he said. "Not really," she said. "Fair." He stopped walking, both hands visible. You're bleeding. I know. The arm or the palm is worse. She glanced down. The palm was road gravel, the arm was the blade, and the arm was the one that needed pressure. She knew that. She was already filing it away for the moment when she had a spare hand. The arm. He reached into the pack slung across his back and produced a cloth, plain, clean, folded. He held it out. She didn't take it. Who are you? Rael. He said it like it was the whole answer. That tells me nothing. It tells you a name. He kept the cloth extended, waiting. You're about 3 minutes from that cut being a serious problem, and about 4 minutes from those men deciding they should come back with more company. So you can stand here asking questions I'll answer when we're moving, or you can take the cloth. She took the cloth. She pressed it against her arm without looking away from him, and he watched her do it with that same expression. Not impressed, not alarmed, just noting, like she was weather. My attendant, she said. In the trees. She's fine. She rode east like you told her, which was the wrong direction, but east of here is a wide, flat shelf and nothing to run into. He tilted his head. She didn't go far. She's watching from that ridge. He pointed without looking, and from the dark of the ridge she heard Mira's horse shift and blow. She exhaled. Not all the way. You didn't exhale all the way when you were still in the open. You followed us from the road, she said. I was on the road first. You followed me, technically. Something moved near his mouth that was almost a smile and decided not to commit. I've been coming down from the northern pass, saw 3 riders split off the main road about a mile back and start paralleling you in the trees. Didn't like the look of it. Why? He looked at her. Why what? Why does it matter to you what happens to 2 women on a mountain road at night? The not quite smile again. Ask a simpler question. She stared at him. He stared back. The mountain wind moved between them and the cold was serious now, the altitude cold that got into joints and made decisions for you if you stood still long enough. Those men, she said, they'll come back. Yes. So we need to move. That's what I've been saying. I'm not going anywhere with a man I don't know. Then go somewhere without me. He picked up his own pack from where he'd set it down, slung it back across his shoulder. There's a trail half a mile north that cuts through the lower pass. Takes 2 hours on foot, 1 on horseback. There's a settlement on the other side, Mom, not one of the crowns, where they don't ask last names and they charge fairly for a room and a meal. He looked at her arm. And where there's a woman who knows how to close a cut without leaving anything that'll go bad. He turned and started walking north. He did not look back. She watched him for 5 seconds. The cloth was already soaking through. Her horse was still down, still breathing, leg folded under her in the road. She would have to leave the animal, and she hated it, but she would have to, because a horse with a bad leg in mountain dark was a liability she couldn't carry. She could hear Mira picking her way down from the ridge. You don't know this man, she thought. You don't know where he came from, or who sent him, or whether this is a different kind of trap. You also have a cut that needs closing, no horse, 2 women alone on a mountain road, and assassins regrouping somewhere behind you. Celine's people know which road you took. She looked at Mira, who had appeared at her shoulder with her face carefully neutral in the way it went neutral when Mira had strong opinions she was keeping to herself. Well, Evelyn said. He hit 3 armed men in the dark and none of them stayed to argue, Mira said. That's either very good at his job or very lucky. Which do you think? Mira watched the retreating figure on the road ahead. Not lucky, she said. Evelyn started walking. Pochante. His name was Rael, and he volunteered nothing beyond it, which she respected in the specific way she respected anything that didn't waste her time. He walked at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and slow enough that she could keep up without showing effort, and she noticed the calibration of it, and filed it away in the growing folder of things about him she didn't yet have context for. Mira rode. Evelyn walked beside the horse and kept pressure on her arm and thought. The settlement materialized out of the dark after 90 minutes. Not a town, more a collection of structures that had agreed to be near each other, built into the base of a rock shelf the way things built in survival territory always were, low profile, defensible, no banners. The kind of place that existed because kingdoms needed edges, and at the edges, people needed places to put themselves that the kingdom couldn't easily find. She had grown up knowing such places existed. She had never been in one. A woman met them at the outer ring, 50s, gray-streaked hair, eyes that had the particular sharpness of someone who'd been reading strangers for decades and trusted the reading. "Rael," the woman said. "Sona." He tilted his head toward Evelyn. "Arm needs closing." Sona looked at Evelyn with the direct impersonal assessment of a field medic, eyes going immediately to the cloth-wrapped arm. "Inside," she said. To Rael, "You staying?" "Hour," he said. "Then I need to be moving." Sona took Evelyn to a back room that smelled of pine resin and dried herb, and she cleaned the cut with something that bit hard and did not apologize for it, and she closed it with a needle and thread while Evelyn sat on a wooden stool and kept her breathing even. The cut was clean. A blade cut was always cleaner than a fall, and she was lucky in that specific way. "Mountain woman?" Sona asked, making conversation in the distant way of someone who wasn't actually looking for conversation. "Border house," Evelyn said. "Originally." Sona nodded. "Hands say so." She tied off the last stitch with efficient finality. "You heading north or going back?" "North." "Anyone coming after you?" A beat. "Probably." Sona looked at her for the first time with something like direct attention. "Crown business?" "Not anymore," Evelyn said. The woman sat back, regarding her with those experienced eyes, and Evelyn felt the assessment happening and didn't try to manage it. She was too tired to manage anything except the next necessary thing, and the next necessary thing was not this woman's opinion of her situation. "There's a pack 3 days north," Sona said finally. "The Iron Veil. They don't run under any crown, and they don't turn away women who come alone if the women can pull their own weight." She paused. "You look like someone who can pull weight." "I can." Sona nodded once and stood up. "Food's at the main table. Sleep if you can, leave before light if you're worried about company." She found Rael outside, sitting on a low wall with his back against the rock shelf and his eyes on the northern road. He had food, bread and dried meat, and he held a second portion out to her when she sat down nearby. She took it without ceremony. They ate in silence for a while. The mountain dark was complete now, the settlement's few lights absorbed by the scale of everything above and around them, and the cold had settled in for the long portion of the night. "The Crimson House," Rael said. She looked at him. "The mark on those men's wrists," he said. "That's Celine's personal guard." She was quiet. "You came from Dusk Hollow tonight," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Moon crown ceremony." She took a breath. "Yes." He nodded slowly, like something had confirmed itself. He didn't press. He sat with the information the way he sat with everything, apparently, without urgency, without performance. "She had that order standing," Evelyn said. The words came out quieter than she'd intended, and she didn't bother pulling them back. "Before tonight. She sent them before she even had the crown on her head." She looked at her hands. "She wasn't securing a position. She was eliminating a threat." "That's usually what securing a position looks like," Rael said. She turned that over. He was right, and the rightness of it was clarifying in a cold way. It told her something about Celine she'd been partially seeing for months, and now saw whole. Celine had never been playing a love story. She'd been playing a war, and Evelyn had been reading it as the wrong genre. "You know what she's afraid of," Rael said. "An heir," Evelyn said. The word fell out of her before she thought about whether she was saying it, and she heard it land in the night air and knew immediately she'd said too much. She felt Rael go still beside her, not dramatically. Just the specific quality of a man who had been relaxed and was now paying a different kind of attention. She did not look at him. "That's why she wanted you gone before morning," he said. Slow, working it out. "Not because of the ceremony, because if the Alpha King ever—" He stopped. The silence between them had a shape. She kept her eyes on the dark road north and did not confirm or deny anything, and he let her not confirm it, and that silence was the first real trust that passed between them, the understanding that she had said enough and he was not going to push past it. "The Iron Veil pack," she said. Sona mentioned them. I know them. A pause. I can get you there. Why? He looked at her. In the dark, his face was all angle and shadow, difficult to read. Because those men are going to come back with more company, and 3 days on mountain roads alone with a cut arm and one horse isn't a plan. And what do you get out of it? I'm going that direction anyway. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. He stood up, brushing breadcrumbs off his coat with the lack of ceremony of a man who is already thinking about the next mile. You don't have to trust me. You just have to make a decision. She stood up. She looked north, where the mountains went black into blacker, and the road disappeared into the kind of dark that was not emptiness but density. Territory that had its own rules and its own costs, and would charge both regardless of whether she was ready to pay. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, one quick touch, private and certain. We keep moving, she told the second heartbeat. She looked at Rael. Dawn, she said. We leave at dawn. He nodded. No ceremony. He turned toward the settlement. She stayed a moment longer in the cold, looking south. Not at the palace, she couldn't see the palace, but at the road she'd come from, the road that was now almost certainly carrying men who were carrying Celine's orders, and her particular brand of thorough. 3 days to the Iron Veil pack. A wound that needed to stay clean, a secret that was getting harder to carry alone. And somewhere behind her, in the palace that had stopped being hers before she'd finished understanding it was gone, the moon crown sat on a woman's head, and the throne sat waiting. And the man who'd put her here had no idea that the one thing that could never be taken from him was already gone. Riding north in the dark in the body of the woman he'd called weak in front of 47 noble houses and 400 wolves. He'll know eventually, she thought. When he does, it won't be because I told him. She turned north and went inside. 3 days north. And Celine's people were already somewhere on the road behind her, and they weren't slowing down, and they weren't coming alone, and Evelyn understood. With the clean, unflinching clarity of someone who had just survived the first attempt and was already calculating the second, that this was not the end of Celine's reach. It was the beginning. The 3 days Sona had promised took 4, because the second morning brought a storm off the upper peaks that turned the trail into a slate-gray river of runoff and mud and made the horses earn every step. Evelyn did not complain about this. She had grown up in border house winters, and she understood that the mountain did not negotiate, and she had spent enough of her life in places that would not bend for her comfort that she'd stopped expecting them to. She put her head down and she walked when the footing was bad, and she rode when it wasn't, and she kept her hand away from the cut on her arm except to check it, and she watched Rael. That was the thing she could not stop doing, watching him. Not because he was remarkable to look at, though he was in the way that functional things were, the way a good blade or a well-built bridge was, without ornament and none needed. She watched him because she was trying to read him and could not, and she had always been able to read people. It was the skill her father had valued most in her, and the one that had failed her most completely in the months before the ceremony, and she was not going to let it fail her again. Rael moved through the mountain like someone who had an arrangement with it. He knew where the trail was solid before he stepped on it. He knew when the storm was going to ease 20 minutes before it eased. He ate what was available without comment and slept when they stopped with the immediate totality of a man who had no unfinished business with his own conscience. She could not tell whether that was peace or absence, and she could not tell whether it mattered. On the third night, with the settlement a half-day behind them and the Iron Veil territory a half-day ahead, they made camp in the shelter of a granite overhang, and Mira fell asleep within minutes the way the young and pragmatic could, boneless and immediate. And Evelyn sat by the low fire with her arm propped on her knee and her eyes on the dark. You keep waiting for the other problem, Rael said. She looked at him across the fire. I keep waiting because there's always another problem. Not always. In my experience. He was quiet for a moment, feeding a thin branch into the fire with the patience of someone who understood small economies. How long were you at Dusk Hollow? 3 years. And before that? My father's house, the Ashford borderlands. She paused. East Ridge territory. He nodded, and she saw something in the nod that was more than acknowledgement, something like familiarity. I know the East Ridge. You're from the north. Originally. He turned the branch. I've been a lot of places. She wanted to press him and did not, because she had traded enough unnamed information with this man over 4 days that pushing for his history felt like it would cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. There was a balance in their silence that she valued more than whatever clarity she'd get from the answer. What she said instead was, "Why does the Iron Veil Pack accept women alone?" He looked at her. Firelight made his face more readable than the dark had, and what she read was something thoughtful and also something careful. Because the woman who runs the Iron Veil spent 15 years in a crown-bound pack and left it the same way you left Dusk Hollow. A beat. "At night," Evelyn said. "At night," he confirmed. She built what she wanted instead of fighting for what wouldn't hold her. Now she runs the most stable independent territory in the Northern Range. He paused. She doesn't like crown wolves, but she respects ones who've decided to stop being crown wolves. Evelyn turned that over. The fire was very small and very warm in the specific way of fires in cold places, disproportionate in their comfort, making the darkness around them heavier by contrast. "She'll ask who I am," Evelyn said. "She'll ask who you were," Rael said. "There's a difference." She pressed her palm flat against her stomach once under cover of adjusting her coat. The second pulse was steady. It had been steady for 4 days, through the storm and the road and the cold and the adrenaline, and every time she checked she felt the same answering warmth, that small, stubborn gravity of presence, and she thought, "You are the most practical thing that has ever happened to me." Hold on. The Iron Veil settlement was not what she'd expected, which meant she'd been expecting the wrong things. She had constructed, from Sona's brief description and Rael's spare addition, something like the rough mountain camps she'd known from border patrols. Functional, defended, cheerless in the way of places built for endurance. What she found was a cluster of low stone buildings arranged with genuine intentionality, built into the base of a cliff face that the settlement used as a north wall, with a wide cleared ground in the center and gardens, actual gardens, brown now in late season, but structured, planned, the beds edged with flat stones, running along the southern exposure. Children. She hadn't expected children. 3 of them crossed the central ground when she and Mira and Rael rode in, ages roughly 4 to 8, moving with the loose confidence of young things in a place where they were not afraid. And one of them, the smallest, stopped and stared at Evelyn's horse with an open-mouthed reverence that made something in her chest do something she couldn't immediately categorize. A woman came out of the largest building. She was maybe 55, maybe older, with the build of someone who had been strong her whole life and had not apologized for it, and gray-silver hair cut short and practical, and eyes the specific color of deep water, that blue-gray that wasn't pretty so much as serious. She looked at Rael with the comfort of familiarity. "You're late," she said. "Storm," he said. "I know about the storm. I have eyes." She looked at Evelyn, not at her clothes, not at her wound, at her face, the direct reading of a woman who knew faces were where the real information lived. "You're from Dusk Hollow." It was not a question, so Evelyn did not treat it like one. "I was from Dusk Hollow. I'm from the East Ridge originally." "Ashford Lands." Evelyn kept her face still. "You know them." "I know most of the border houses. I've been around long enough." The woman, Evelyn had already decided this was the person who ran the Iron Veil, the one Rael had described, tilted her head fractionally. "I'm Vanna. This is my territory. You're welcome in it for as long as you need to be, with 2 conditions." "Name them." "You don't bring the Crown's problems into my walls, and you don't lie to me." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "The Crown's problems followed me 4 miles out of Dusk Hollow, and I dealt with them. Whether they stay dealt is a question of time." She paused. "And I don't lie." Vanna studied her for a long moment with those serious, water-blue eyes. "No," Vanna said finally. "I don't think you do." She stepped back and gestured toward the main building. "Come inside. You need that arm looked at properly." But she stayed. Not permanently. She hadn't decided permanently. She was not someone who decided permanently about anything she hadn't yet fully understood. But she stayed through the first week, which became the first month. because the Iron Veil was something she hadn't known she was looking for. It was governed by competence. That was the thing she couldn't stop noticing, the way you noticed light after a long time in dark rooms. In Dusk Hollow, authority had been about dominance, about the performance of strength, about who could hold the most ground by force of will and willingness to spend other people's costs. In the Iron Veil, authority was quieter and more ruthless in its own way. Vanna's word was final, because she'd earned the right to have it be final, and everyone here knew the cost of what she'd built, and that knowledge ran under everything like bedrock. Evelyn worked. She offered skills before she was asked for them. Her father had raised her with the border house ethic that you paid for what you used, and she had arrived with nothing except capability and a secret. And capability was the only currency she had in any form. She knew medicinal plants from the East Ridge education of her childhood. She knew horses. She knew, with the particular expertise of someone who had spent 3 years watching a king manage the politics of rival pacts, how to read a negotiation before it declared itself. Vanna used all of it. Mira found her footing within 2 weeks with the quiet adaptability of someone who had always survived by becoming necessary. And Evelyn watched with something like pride and also something like grief. Grief for the girl's lost ordinary life, which had been sacrificed without complaint on the altar of loyalty to someone who hadn't asked for it. Rael stayed for 11 days and then left one morning before the settlement woke, which was precisely what she had expected him to do. And she found she was not surprised and not wounded, and she was not sure what that said about her and decided not to examine it. He left the road north open. That was enough. The pregnancy became visible in the 3rd month. Vanna said nothing until Evelyn said it first, which was the kind of tactful discipline that Evelyn had not encountered in a long time, and when she said it, sitting across from Vanna at the work table in the main building, laying it out plainly, no maneuvering, no preface, the older woman listened and nodded once and said, "The father." "Won't know," Evelyn said. "Won't be told." Vanna looked at her. Is that a protection or a punishment? The question was so direct it almost broke something in her chest. She sat with it for a moment, longer than she intended, and she said, "I don't know yet. Maybe both." Vanna nodded again and moved on and did not return to it. Both. The news came in the 8th month. A trader, one of the 3 who ran regular supply routes between the northern independent territories and the crown-bound border towns, arrived with his cart and his toll of gossip. And Evelyn was in the garden when she heard Vanna's voice change in a way that made her straighten up and pay attention. She heard Kaylin's name, then Celine's, then a phrase she could not fully make out from where she was standing. She went inside. Vanna was standing at the table with the trader's report in front of her, and an expression Evelyn had not seen on the older woman's face before. Something between reluctance and decision, the face of someone about to deliver news they've already calculated the cost of. "Sit down," Vanna said. "Tell me." "Sit down first." She sat. Vanna set the report on the table and placed both hands flat on the wood beside it, not pushing it toward Evelyn but not keeping it from her either. "The border traders talk," she said. "They always talk. And what they're talking about from the Crown territory is—" She stopped, started again. "Kaylin's father is dead. Has been, for longer than anyone knew. The official account is that Alpha King Dorian died of illness 6 years ago, before Kaylin took the throne." Evelyn stared at her. "I know, the fever. I was there for Kaylin's ascension. I joined his house after—" "It wasn't a fever." Vanna said it flat and final, and without gentleness, because Vanna had always understood that false gentleness was its own cruelty. "The traders are bringing word out of the capital that Celine's personal counsel, the same men who were her advisors before she became Luna, had dealings with the Rogue Alliance, the ones responsible for raids on the northern border 6 years ago." The room was very still. "The Rogue Alliance," Evelyn said slowly, "that Kaylin sent 3 battalions to destroy, that he blamed for his father's death. Yes, Celine's counsel." She heard herself say it, heard the words arrange themselves in the air between her and everything she understood. "Celine was positioned in Kaylin's court for 2 years before I came. She had his father's ear before she had Kaylin's." Vanna did not answer, because the answer was in her face. The thing that Evelyn felt in that moment was not the grief she might have expected, and not the fury, though fury was coming. She could feel it gathering at the base of her throat like something with teeth. What she felt first was the nauseating, specific vertigo of a pattern completing itself, of seeing the shape of something she'd been standing too close to see whole. Celine had not maneuvered Kaelin away from Evelyn to secure a crown. The crown was the last step, not the first. The first step had been 6 years ago, when someone in Celine's circle had made an arrangement with a rogue pack, and Alpha King Dorian had died, and a younger and more manipulable Kaelin had ascended and needed comfort, and Celine had been there. Evelyn had walked into a story that was already 2 years old when she arrived. She had been the complication, not the target, until she became the target. She pressed both hands flat on her own knees and looked at nothing and breathed. "There's more," Vanna said. She looked up. "Kaelin is alive. The traders say Celine moved against him directly 2 weeks ago during the blood moon preparation. Something went wrong with her timing. He survived." Vanna's jaw was set. "But barely. And the capital is in chaos. The rival packs are reading it as vulnerability. 3 border territories have already declared themselves ungoverned." She paused. "The kingdom is fracturing." His arrogance nearly destroyed his bloodline, Evelyn had thought the night she left. His kingdom, the woman who truly loved him. She had thought it as prophecy. She had not understood it was also a timeline. She sat in the silence of Vanna's main hall, 8 months pregnant with the only true heir to a fracturing throne, and she felt the shape of everything close around her like the granite walls of this mountain settlement, solid and permanent and without negotiation. The man she had left was in danger from the woman he had chosen over her. Her son. She had known for weeks it was a son, felt it in the particular way the pregnancy had weighted itself, the forward press of his presence. Her son carried bloodline power that no amount of Celine's maneuvering could cancel or replace. And Celine knew that. Celine had always known that. She wanted the heir dead, Evelyn had realized the night of the attack. She had been right. She just hadn't understood the full dimension of what she was right about. The assassins on the mountain road had not been panic. They had been contingency. Celine had sent them because Celine understood that an heir changes every calculation in a kingdom, that a crown without bloodline continuity is just metal on a head, and that metal was only worth protecting if the line died with it. Evelyn's son was the line. Mira appeared in the doorway from the corridor and stopped when she read the room. "What happened?" Mira said. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She was still processing the pivot, the way a mind reorganizes itself when it has been operating on the wrong premise. She had built her entire North Route survival plan on a single foundation: stay invisible, stay safe, stay gone. That foundation had just collapsed, not because Celine had found her, but because Celine had moved on Kaelin before Evelyn's existence as a problem needed resolving. Because the kingdom fracturing meant the borders were opening, the independent territories were declaring, and rogue wolves ran best in open ground. "He's alive," she thought, and hated that the first thing she felt at that information was relief, and hated herself for the hatred, because relief meant the mate bond was still running its wire through her chest, regardless of everything she'd built on top of it. "He's alive and the kingdom is fracturing and Celine is still in the palace and my son is going to be born into a world where the throne his blood is heir to is collapsing." She looked down at her hands. Steady. They had been steady all night, through the road and the storm and the assassins and every quiet, terrible morning since, and they were steady now, and she looked at them like they belonged to someone she was still in the process of becoming. She had left Dusk Hollow as a woman running. She had arrived in the north as a woman surviving. She understood, with the full weight of the mountain silence around her and Vanna's careful eyes on her face and the steady second pulse beneath her own ribs, that surviving was no longer enough. She looked up at Vanna. "How long to the capital?" she said. "If I'm not hiding." Vanna went very still. "I'm not going back as what I was," Evelyn said. Her voice was level and cold and entirely her own. "I'm not going back to reclaim a title or beg a man's forgiveness or fight for a position I was thrown out of in front of 400 witnesses." She held Vanna's gaze. "I'm going back because my son is heir to a throne that's being dismantled by a woman who murdered its king's father and bent a second king to her will, And I am not going to raise him in a world where that woman wins. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain wind moved. Mira was very still in the doorway. Vanna looked at her for a long moment, that deep water assessment that had read her correctly since the first day. And then something shifted in the older woman's face, something that was not approval and not surprise, but was recognition. 2 weeks, Vanna said. After the child is born and you're fit to ride. 3 days after, Evelyn said. 2 weeks, Vanna said again. Final. You'll be no use to anyone if you bleed out on the road. Evelyn looked at her, looked at the report on the table, looked at the walls of this place that had held her when she had nothing to hold herself upright with, and felt the weight of what she was choosing settle across her shoulders, like something she'd been carrying her whole life without knowing what it was for. She nodded once, and the woman who had walked out of Dusk Hollow Palace in silence and tears began, quietly and without ceremony, to become something else entirely. Lucian was born on the coldest morning of the year, when the mountain pressed its silence down over the Ironvale settlement like a hand over a mouth, and the fire in Vanna's main hall burned without sound, and Evelyn did not make a single noise that she did not choose to make. She had decided that beforehand. She had decided a lot of things beforehand, in the way she decided everything now, stripped of sentiment, assessed for utility, committed to without revision. She would not cry out. She would not beg for it to end. She would hold the thing she was building in her mind, and she would breathe through everything between here and it. Vanna had said afterward that she delivered maybe 200 children over a lifetime in the Northern Territories, and she'd never seen one come out the way Lucian came out, not crying, but alert, eyes open and dark, and already looking at the room like he was cataloging it. He's assessing us, Mira had said, from the corner, her voice doing something unsteady. He's cold, Vanna had said, and wrapped him. But even Vanna's hands had paused for a moment, Evelyn had noticed, when she lifted him, a fraction of a hesitation that meant she'd felt something. That specific current that ran under his skin even then, that warmth before warmth that was not temperature. The old bloodline signature, buried in wolf genetics so deep it predated most of what called itself civilization. The alpha aura, not developed yet, not conscious, but present. Evelyn had held him and looked at his face and felt the second pulse align with her own for the first time, no longer separate, no longer interior, but there in her arms, answering, and she had allowed herself exactly one moment of something that was not strategy or survival or calculation. Then she had handed him to Mira, looked at Vanna, and said, 2 weeks. Vanna had looked back at her and had not argued. Bam. The 2 weeks passed, the way time passed when you were training for something your body did not yet know how to do, badly and fast, and with the specific ache of a self being remade. She rode every day she was fit to ride. She worked her sword arm back to readiness with the grim efficiency of someone paying a debt. And Vanna watched without comment and occasionally corrected her grip in the wordless language of someone who had done this before. She nursed Lucian in the mornings and the evenings and felt the weight of him with a ferocity she hadn't anticipated, had not anticipated how it would reorganize her entirely, not softening her the way she'd feared, but hardening her in a different direction, the way metal hardened differently depending on what it was cooled against. She wrote one letter to Rael. She did not know where he was. She gave it to the next trader heading north and trusted the network. It said, coming south, Dusk Hollow. Need to know what's standing and what's already fallen. If you hear this before I reach you, meet me at the Grave Isle Crossing. She folded it once and sent it, and did not wait for confirmation, because waiting for confirmation was a luxury she'd already decided she couldn't afford. On the 14th morning, she strapped Lucian against her chest in the carrier Vanna had made, tight, functional, the way everything Vanna made was tight and functional. And she looked at the main building and the gardens and the low stone walls of the place that had held her through the worst of it, and she felt the particular feeling of leaving somewhere that had been real, which was different from the feeling of leaving somewhere you had merely been. Vanna stood at the gate. If you die on this road, Vanna said, I will be very disappointed. I know, Evelyn said. The boy, Vanna said. She looked at Lucian, who was looking back at her with those dark, assessing eyes. Something crossed the older woman's face. something that might have been the closest Vanna got to tenderness. He's going to be a problem for everyone he meets. That's the plan, Evelyn said. Mira was already mounted. Evelyn swung up, settled Lucian's weight against her chest, and turned south. Well done. The Greyveal crossing was a 3-day ride, even with good roads, and the roads were not good. The border territories that had declared themselves ungoverned had also, apparently, decided that road maintenance was the Crown's problem, and therefore no longer theirs. And the result was 2 days of trail that had been left to its own devices long enough to develop opinions about direction. She was a day out from the crossing when she started seeing the signs of what the traders had described as fracturing, and she now understood was more accurately described as dissolution. Empty border posts, a village that had pulled its gates closed and was not answering, the specific silence of a territory that had contracted into itself, drawing its edges in tight against whatever was coming. Kaelin's kingdom had been built on dominance, on the understanding that the Alpha King's authority ran from the palace to every pack within 3 days' ride in any direction, and that understanding had held because it had not been tested. Now it was being tested, and the result was the particular ugliness of power exposed as contingent. All the packs that had bent the knee because it was easier than fighting suddenly discovering they had a choice. She had watched Kaelin manage this dynamic for 3 years from the inside, and she knew exactly what he would be doing, marshalling, commanding, projecting strength even half destroyed, because men like Kaelin understood on a bone-deep level that authority was performance as much as fact, that the moment you stopped performing it, you lost it. The question was whether he still had enough of the machine intact to perform with. She was thinking about this, riding through the silence of a border post that should have had 6 guards and had none, when she heard a horse behind her. Her hand was at her blade before she turned. Rael. He looked the same. Dark clothes, no insignia, the lean altitude-built height of him familiar now in a way she hadn't anticipated, the way certain silhouettes became landscape after you've relied on them. "You're early," he said. "You got the letter fast," she said. "I was already coming south." He pulled his horse alongside hers and looked at the bundle against her chest and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Boy or girl?" "Boy," she said. He nodded. No performance, just the acknowledgement of something important. "Name?" "Lucian." Rael looked at Lucian, who looked back at him. The baby's expression was, as always, disconcertingly direct. Rael's mouth did the almost smile. "He looks like he's already decided something about me," Rael said. "He looks like that at everyone," Evelyn said. "Tell me about the capital." But he told her while they rode, and what he told her was worse than the trader's version, and she suspected the trader's version had already been bad enough. Celine had moved against Kaelin at the Blood Moon Festival preparation. A coordinated attempt, multiple vectors, the kind of plan that took months to build and required people embedded in Kaelin's own guard. It had almost worked. Kaelin had survived because one of his oldest commanders, a man named Bren who had served Kaelin's father, had died throwing himself between the Alpha King and the blade meant for him. Kaelin was alive. He was in the palace. He was holding it by force of will and the loyalty of maybe 30 soldiers he trusted completely, in a capital that was churning with confusion and fear and the specific opportunism that rose off a wounded throne like heat off stone. Celine was still there. That was the part that made Evelyn's jaw tighten. Celine had not fled. She was still in the palace, still presenting herself as Luna, and because Kaelin could not prove the assassination attempt publicly without exposing every fracture in his own authority, she was still untouchable. She had surrounded herself with her own people. She had locked down the Eastern Wing, and she was apparently in communication with the Rogue Alliance, the same wolves responsible for Dorian's death, about terms for a transfer of power. "She's going to hand the kingdom to the Rogue Packs," Evelyn said. "She's going to negotiate herself a guaranteed position within whatever structure they install," Rael said. "She doesn't care about Dusk Hollow as a kingdom. She never did. She cares about Celine. Which means she needs Kaelin dead and the heir question resolved before she makes the deal." Rael looked at her. "Which means she still needs you dead." Lucian made a small sound against her chest. She pressed her palm flat against his back, feeling his breathing, that steady rhythm. How many people does she have in the palace? Evelyn said. 30, maybe 40 of her personal guard, plus whatever of Kaelin's forces she's managed to turn. He paused. The Rogue Alliance has scouts at the Eastern Gate. Not inside yet, but close. And Kaelin's 30? Plus Kaelin, Rael said, and something in his voice acknowledged the weight of that. That a half-destroyed Alpha King fighting for his own palace was not nothing, was in fact a considerable problem for anyone trying to take it. She processed this. The road ahead was straightening out, the border territory scrub giving way to the broader flat that preceded the Greyville crossing, and beyond that the crown road that ran direct to Dusk Hollow, and beyond that the palace she had ridden away from in the dark with everything that mattered pressed against her body. There's something else, Rael said. She looked at him. Kaelin's been asking, he said carefully, about you. The traders heard it second and third hand, but it's been consistent. He's put word out through the northern contacts that he's looking for information about where you went. The mate bond ran its wire through her chest, that familiar signal, and she pressed it down hard. When did he start? About a month after you left. Rael paused. The night his commander Bren died, apparently, he made a statement in front of his remaining guard. Traders don't agree on the exact words, but they agree on the substance. He was watching her carefully now. He said Bren died for a throne that only had one legitimate heir, and he was going to find that heir if it was the last thing he managed. The road went under her horse's hooves, and she did not look at Rael and did not look at Lucian, and she looked instead at the Greyville crossing coming up ahead, the wide, flat stones of it, the gray water running fast beneath. He knew, she thought. Before I came back. He figured out there was an heir, and he knew it was mine, and he's been looking. She felt something complicated move through her that she did not stop to name. She pressed it down beside the mate bond signal and kept it there. It changes nothing about why I'm going back, she said. I know, Rael said, and it changes nothing about the terms. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. I'm coming in with you. She looked at him. You need someone who knows the palace layout who isn't already tracked by Celine's people, he said. I've been through Dusk Hollow twice in the last 6 months. I know which gates are still Kaelin's. She looked at him long enough to read him. That face she'd been reading for months now, the one she still could not fully decode but had come to trust in the specific way you trusted a road that had held your weight before. He was not offering protection, he was offering function. There was a difference, and he knew she knew it. Which gate? She said. Western Postern, he said. Kaelin's man on the third watch. She nodded. They crossed the Greyville as the sun dropped and rode hard for Dusk Hollow. The capital at night was nothing like the capital she had left. She had expected the palace to look the same. She had not expected to be affected by it looking the same. Those torchlit towers against the dark mountain sky, the moon crest visible on the outer wall even at distance, and she was briefly, savagely angry at herself for the 2 seconds of recognition that ran through her before she shut it down. This is not coming home, she told herself. This is coming back. There is a difference. Rael brought them to the Western Postern with the confidence of someone who had memorized a route rather than traveled it, and the man at the gate, a compact wolf with a scar across his jaw and the eyes of someone who'd been sleeping in armor for weeks, took one look at Rael and stepped back. She's with me, Rael said. The guard looked at Evelyn, then at Lucian, asleep against her chest. That dark hair, that face that already carried the Alpha King's jaw in miniature. His throat moved. The king needs to know, the guard said. The king will know, Sect, Evelyn said. Take me to him. The guard made a decision the way people made decisions when they were very tired, and the decision in front of them was the one that ended uncertainty. He moved. Kaelin was in the war room. She heard him before she saw him. That voice, filling the space between stone walls the way it had always filled every space he occupied, and she felt the mate bond pull with a force she hadn't been ready for, close range and immediate, and she clenched every muscle she had and walked through the door. He had his back to her. He was standing over a map table with 2 men she didn't recognize flanking him, pointing at something in the eastern section. And he was speaking in that flat, tactical voice she knew from the years she'd spent watching him manage border disputes. And he looked She took him in fast, the way you took in everything fast when there might not be another chance. He looked like a man who'd been burning himself as fuel for weeks and was now down to the last of it. The shoulder was wrong. Something in the set of it, a hitch in how he was carrying his weight, the residue of an injury that hadn't finished healing. His hair was longer than she'd seen it. There was a cut above his left eye that was recent enough to still be livid. He was still standing. She registered that. She also registered the moment he smelled her. He went completely still. The men beside him looked up because the Alpha King had stopped moving in the middle of a sentence, and Alphas did not stop in the middle of sentences. Kaylin turned. She had prepared herself for this. She had spent 3 days on the road rehearsing the version of herself she was going to walk through this door as composed, cold, purposeful, every line of her body communicating that she was here on her terms and no others. She had prepared for it. She had not prepared for the look on his face. It was not relief. It was not guilt. It was something that had been compressed past its own name, something that lived under the architecture of a man who had been spending everything he had on keeping upright. And it crossed his face in the 2 seconds before he controlled it with the iron discipline she'd watched him apply to everything, always, and she felt it like a physical impact in the center of her chest. He looked at Lucian. He looked at the child sleeping against her chest, at the dark hair and the jaw that was Kaylin's jaw and the hands curled small at the edge of the carrier that were Evelyn's hands scaled down, and she watched him understand. Watch the calculation complete itself in real time across his face, the way you watched a building's structural failure move from crack to collapse, sequential and inevitable. The 2 men beside him had gone completely silent. "Everyone out," Kaylin said. His voice came out level. She gave him credit for that. The men left without discussion. The door closed. The silence in the war room was the loudest thing Evelyn had heard in months. Kaylin looked at her. He looked at Lucian. He looked back at her, and his throat moved once, and she watched him make the decision to speak, and she kept her face perfectly, entirely still. "How old?" he said. 4 months, she said, the muscle in his jaw, the hitch in the injured shoulder as he absorbed it. She counted the months forward from the night she'd left, and watched him do the same arithmetic, and watched him land on the ceremony night, that specific night, and watched his face do something that had no clean name. "You knew," he said. "That night. You knew." "Yes." 1 word. She gave him nothing extra. "And you left with—" He stopped. Started again. "You rode north pregnant and alone, and you didn't— You called me weak," she said. The words came out without inflection. Not bitter, not performed, just factual, the way you stated the terms of a contract. In front of 47 noble houses and 400 warriors, you said I was unworthy of carrying the future of the throne. She held his gaze. "I took you at your word." The silence that followed was a different quality, not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people absorbing a truth that had been in the room the whole time. Kaylin looked at his son. She watched the man she had spent 3 years loving and 1 year surviving look at his only heir, and she watched him understand, not the political fact of it, which she knew he'd processed already with that king's mind, but the other thing, the irreversible human fact of it, the weight of what he had been within a breath of never knowing. "Evelyn," he said, "don't." She said it the same way she'd said it a year ago in the Great Hall, the same line. "I didn't come back for this conversation." "Then why?" "Because Celine murdered your father." She said it directly, no preface, and watched it hit him. Her counsel worked with the Rogue Alliance 6 years ago. Dorian didn't die of fever. He was arranged, and she's been arranging everything since. She kept her voice flat and rapid, the briefing voice, stripping it of everything except information. "She's in contact with the Rogue Wolves right now about terms for a handover. She needs you dead, and she needs my son dead, and she's had people looking for us since the night she put your crown on her head." Kaylin had gone very still. Not the stillness of shock. She knew what shock looked like on his face. This was the stillness of something older. The alpha stillness. The predator registering a threat vector. All that considerable intelligence contracting to a single cold point. "How long have you known?" he said. 8 months. She held his gaze. I needed to be in a position to come back before I came back. He looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look, because there was nothing in her face she was hiding, and there was nothing he was going to find that she hadn't chosen to put there. She had walked through that door as exactly the woman she had spent a year building, and she was not going to apologize for a single day of that construction. Lucian, he said, trying the name. Something moved in his face. Lucian, she confirmed. A sound from the corridor. Boots on stone, the specific rhythm of someone moving fast and trying not to sound like it. Rael appeared in the doorway with his jaw set and his eyes sharp. Celine's guard is moving, he said. Eastern wing, heading this way. Kaelin's head came up. That alpha readiness, immediate and complete. The man who'd been holding a fracturing kingdom together by force of will, settling into himself like a blade finding its sheath. Evelyn looked at Rael, looked at Kaelin, pressed her palm one last time against Lucian's sleeping back. How many? She said to Rael. 20, minimum, plus the rogue scouts. They breached the eastern gate 10 minutes ago. Celine opened it. Rael was already moving into the room, pulling the door shut behind him. She knew you came in. Someone at the western gate talked. Kaelin looked at Evelyn. The look had a specific quality she had not seen on him before. Not apology, he hadn't gotten there yet. She was not sure he knew how, but something that was its own kind of reckoning. The boy, he said. Mira, Evelyn said. She had sent Mira to the northern servants' quarters the moment they'd come through the postern, the part of the palace that Seleni's people had never bothered to control because servants were invisible until they weren't. He's safe. Kaelin nodded once, and she watched him put his son away in a compartment of his mind the way he put everything he needed to protect away. Sealed, guarded, fuel for the thing he was about to do. He straightened to his full height, picked up the blade from the map table. You know this palace better than she does, he said to Evelyn. I know the passages she doesn't know exist, Evelyn said. The ones your father built. His jaw tightened. His father. He absorbed that. Then you lead, he said. She looked at the man who had broken her publicly and completely, who had not known the cost of what he was spending, who had a son he'd never touched sleeping 4 rooms away, who was holding a blade and looking at her with the specific expression of someone who understood that they owed a debt they could not yet calculate. If we survive this, she said, low, we settle things. Yes, he said. Not the way you want to settle them, she said. On my terms. A beat, his jaw, his eyes on her, and in them something she had not expected. Not argument, not the arrogance that had cost them both everything, but something that looked, stripped of everything else, like agreement. On your terms, he said. She turned to the door. 20 of Celine's guard, rogue wolves in the eastern wing, a fractured capital, and a son 4 rooms away who carried power old enough to crack the throne room floor. She pressed the hidden panel beside the war room fireplace, 3rd stone from the top, the seam her fingers had memorized years ago out of habit and now needed for the first time. And the passage opened. Move, she said. They moved, and in the corridor behind them, the sound of Celine's boots on palace stone grew louder, and the rogue wolves howled once in the eastern courtyard, and the last night of the old order came down on Dusk Hollow Palace like everything that had been building for 6 years, finally deciding it was done waiting. The passage was black and close and smelled of old stone and the specific cold of places that never saw light, and Evelyn moved through it without hesitation because she had memorized it years ago in a different life. Walking it alone on sleepless nights when the palace had felt like a territory she was still learning to occupy. She had not known, then, what she was memorizing it for. She knew now. Rael was behind her, and Kaelin was behind Rael, and she could feel Kaelin's presence the way she had always been able to feel it. That specific gravity, the mate bond signal running its wire through her chest even now, even here, in the dark with 20 armed wolves moving through the corridors above their heads. She did not look back. She moved. The passage split at the second junction. Left went toward the throne room. Right went toward the servants' quarters. She went right first. Evelyn? Kaelin's voice, low, controlled. Mira has my son, she said without stopping. We get him secured before we go anywhere near the throne room." A beat of silence that was not argument, but was the sound of a man recalibrating. Then his footsteps followed. Mira was where Evelyn had told her to be. The lower servants' hall, the room with the exterior wall, and the window that faced the western cliff face. The one that had a 3-foot drop to a ledge, and then a gully that ran north away from the palace grounds. Evelyn had identified that exit on her 3rd week in the palace and had never mentioned it to anyone. She had a habit of identifying exits. Mira opened the door before they knocked, because Mira had always operated slightly ahead of events. And she had Lucian in her arms, and her face was the controlled careful it went when she was frightened and refusing to perform it. Kaelin stopped in the doorway. He stopped because Lucian was awake. The baby was looking at him with those dark, assessing eyes, and the recognition that moved across Kaelin's face was the most unguarded thing Evelyn had ever seen on him, raw and immediate and entirely unmanaged. The expression of a man whose defenses had been built for every kind of threat except this one. Lucian made a sound. Not distressed. Curious. "He looks at everything like that," Mira said, with the specific dry tone she used when she was managing her own emotion by talking around it. Kaelin's throat moved. His hand came up, that broad, blade-calloused hand, and stopped 6 inches from Lucian's face, and Evelyn watched him ask permission in the only way he knew how, which was to stop and wait. Lucian grabbed his finger. The grip of a 4-month-old was not strong. It was not supposed to be. But even Rael, standing behind Kaelin, went still for a moment because the grip of this specific 4-month-old carried that current, warm and old, and entirely itself. And Kaelin felt it move up his arm and into his chest, and Evelyn watched his eyes close for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, something had shifted in his face, not softened. That was the wrong word for what happened to Kaelin's face. Settled, like tectonic plates that had been grinding for years finally finding their position. "Mira," Evelyn said. "The window. You know where to go." "North Shelf," Mira said. She had already been told. She had been told 3 days ago on the road, because Evelyn planned for the corridor she hoped not to need. Vanna's contact at the Greyvale crossing. "If we're not out by dawn—" "I know," Mira said. She looked at Evelyn with those clear, direct eyes, and then she did something she had never done before. She reached out with her free hand and gripped Evelyn's wrist, one hard, brief pressure, and let go. "Don't make me use the contingency." Kaelin made himself release Lucian's hand. Mira went to the window. Evelyn watched until the ledge took her weight and the dark swallowed both of them, and she held the watching for 3 seconds after they disappeared, held the image of her son's face in the last of the hall's light. And then she turned. "Throne room," she said. They came up through the floor. The throne room had a sub-level access panel behind the dais that Evelyn had discovered in her 2nd year, and Kaelin had apparently not known about, which told her something about how differently they had inhabited the same palace. She came up first, blade drawn, and found the room dark except for the mooncrest silver inlay catching the torchlight from the corridor beyond the main doors. Then the main doors opened. Celine walked in with 12 of her personal guard flanking her and the copper hair loose the way she'd worn it the night of the ceremony, and Evelyn looked at her across the throne room floor, 20 feet of cold stone and a year of everything that had happened, and felt something she had not expected. Not hatred. She had thought it would be hatred, had prepared for the heat of it. What she felt instead was colder and more focused, the thing that lived on the other side of hatred when you'd had time to process it past the initial burn. Recognition. She saw Celine clearly, perhaps for the first time, not the seducer, not the usurper, but the architect, the woman who had planned 6 years ahead and nearly made all of it work. That demanded a specific kind of reckoning. Celine stopped when she saw Evelyn standing in front of the dais. Something moved in her face, a fractional disruption of the control she wore the way other people wore armor. And then it was gone, replaced by the expression Evelyn had watched her deploy 100 times in court. Composed, certain, already 3 moves ahead. "You came back," Celine said. Her voice carried easily in the stone space. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you." "I know," Evelyn said. "That was your mistake." Celine's eyes moved, quick, professional, reading the room, and found Kaelin stepping up from the floor panel, and found Rael positioning near the eastern pillar, and made her calculation, 12 against 3. She liked those odds. Evelyn could see her liking them. "You've been busy," Celine said to Kaelin. The familiarity in her voice was a performance of intimacy, the specific weapon of someone who understood that perceived closeness was leverage. "Crawling through your own floors with your dead exile." "My father," Kaelin said. His voice came out with a quietness that was more dangerous than volume. "Tell me about my father." The room went a different kind of still. Celine's face did not change. That was its own answer. The non-flinch of someone who had already made their peace with what they'd done, who had cauterized the part of themselves that would have reacted. "Your father was a weak king who would have handed the territory to the border wolves inside a decade. Everything I built, everything you took," Evelyn said. Celine looked at her. For the first time, something genuine moved in her expression. Not guilt, not remorse, but the specific acknowledgement of one player to another. "Everything I built," she repeated, deliberate. "Requires a willingness to see what others won't. Kaelin was never going to be strong enough with you beside him. You were always going to be the softness that cost him everything." "You sent assassins after a pregnant woman on a mountain road," Evelyn said. "I sent people to resolve a problem before it became a dynasty." No hesitation. No apology. "That's what governing is. You want to talk to me about cruelty? Ask your mate about how many border wolves he burned out of their territories in his first year on the throne. Power has a cost. The only question is, who pays it?" The words landed in the room, and the room absorbed them, and Evelyn stood with them for a moment because they were not entirely wrong, and the fact that they were not entirely wrong was the most dangerous thing about Celine. She had always been able to make the indefensible sound like pragmatism, and pragmatism was the most seductive language in any empire. But there was a gap between pragmatism and what Celine was, and the gap was this. Celine had never built anything. She had positioned herself within structures other people built, and she had hollowed them out from the inside and called the hollowing governance. "You're not a ruler," Evelyn said. "You're a parasite who learned to talk like one." Celine's jaw tightened. "Take them," she said. Yeah. What happened next was brutal and fast and not clean, because nothing real was ever clean. Rael moved first, the way he always moved, economical, without announcement, taking the nearest guard before the man had finished processing the command. Kaelin went left, and Evelyn saw immediately what 11 months of injury and fractured authority had cost him. The shoulder, the hitch in his reach, the half-second lag on his dominant side. And she saw 2 of Celine's guards see it too, saw them read the weakness, the way trained fighters read everything, and she was already moving. She was not Kaelin's size, she was not Rael's efficiency. What she was, had always been. Her father's border house training ground into her bones before she'd known what it was for, was fast and accurate and entirely willing to be ruthless when the accounting demanded it. She took the first guard who went for Kaelin's bad shoulder, got inside his reach the way she'd learned on a mountain road a year ago, and she was not gentle about it. The throne room floor was cold and hard and unforgiving, and the sounds it made of the next 3 minutes were not sounds she would want to remember and could not avoid remembering. And she moved through them with the focus of someone who had learned, at the most fundamental level, that survival was not a passive condition. You did not survive by being left alone. You survived by being too costly to kill. She had spent a year becoming very costly. Celine did not fight. That was the thing Evelyn registered in the spaces between. Celine stood near the main doors with her composed face and watched her guard work and did not reach for a weapon herself, because Celine had always understood that her power was not in her hands, but in her arrangements. And her final arrangement, Evelyn understood with cold clarity as the fight moved across the throne room floor, was already in motion. The eastern doors burst open. Rogue wolves, not scouts, a full entry team, 8 of them, the rogue alliance that had been waiting at the gate for Celine to deliver the palace, and they came in with the focused violence of wolves who had been given permission and were now taking it at full speed. Rael went down. Not dead. She could hear him, the specific curse that meant pain rather than departure. But down, and the numbers had shifted badly, and Kaelin was already bleeding from the shoulder that had never finished healing. And Evelyn stood in the center of the throne room with the moon crest behind her, and Celine's satisfied expression 20 feet away, and she felt the arithmetic of the situation close around her like walls. This was the moment. She had stood in enough corners to know what a corner felt like. And in that moment, in the breathless pause between one wave of violence and the next, she felt it, a warmth that was not her own, not the mate bond. That was its own signal, running its wire as always. This was different, newer. The specific gravity she had felt for 4 months against her chest, that small, stubborn presence, but amplified, expanded, as if distance had not diminished it but concentrated it, as if the 4 months of his existence had been building to exactly this. Lucian. She did not understand what she was feeling. She had no framework for it, no elder's explanation, nothing except the raw fact of it moving through the throne room air like a change in pressure, like the moment before a storm when everything goes very still. The rogue wolves stopped. Not all at once, one by one, like lights going out, the momentum draining out of them as something moved through the room that was not sound and not light, but was both of those things translated into sensation. The oldest kind of alpha aura, the bloodline aura, the kind that predated conscious control and operated below language, below thought, at the level of the body's most ancient instructions. Kaelin felt it. She saw him feel it. That hitch of recognition, his head coming up, something moving in his face that was shock and something deeper than shock. The rogue wolves were on their knees, not dramatically, not all of them at once, but one, and then two, and then the rest, the way dominoes fell when the first one had enough weight behind it, their bodies responding to something their minds could not argue with. Even Celine's remaining guard, the ones still standing, were bent at the knee with the specific confusion of people whose bodies had made a decision their conscious selves were still catching up to. Celine stood. She was the only one still standing besides Evelyn and Kaelin and Rael dragging himself upright against the eastern pillar. Her face had finally lost its composure. Not broken. Celine did not break. Evelyn understood that. It was the one genuine thing about her. But cracked. The facade showing its seams, and beneath it something that was almost naked. The look of a woman who had built 6 years of architecture and was watching it come apart in a throne room she'd considered already hers. "That's not possible," Celine said. Her voice came out barely altered. Even now, even here, the control was extraordinary. "He's 4 months old," Evelyn said. "Imagine what he'll be in 20 years. Celine looked at her, really looked at her, and Evelyn let her look. Let her see whatever she needed to see. The woman she'd dismissed as soft, as exile material, as a loose end that hadn't been tied tight enough. The woman who had ridden north with nothing and spent a year building something Celine's arrangements could not buy. "You won't kill me," Celine said. "You need witnesses. You need testimony to rebuild what's fractured. You need me alive to—" "I need you gone," Evelyn said. "Those are different things." Kaelin moved to Celine's right, and Evelyn moved to her left, and the copper-haired woman who had worn the moon crown for a year stood between them and did the final calculation and found, for the first time in 6 years of arrangements, that the numbers did not work in her favor. She looked at Kaelin. "Everything I did," she said, and her voice had dropped to something almost private, something that was the closest she would come to what another person might call honesty, was for this throne. "You killed my father for this throne," Kaelin said. His voice was flat stone. "You murdered him, and put his death on wolves I spent years hunting. And the throne is still standing." Her chin came up. "Whatever you think of how I built it." "You didn't build it," Kaelin said. "You occupied it." He stepped forward, and Celine, who had not flinched at anything in this room tonight, stepped back. One step. Involuntary. "The Rogue Alliance names you as the architect of the border raid 6 years ago," Evelyn said. "We have testimony. We have the documentation your council kept, because powerful people always keep documentation. They can't help themselves. It's how they manage what they've built." She held Celine's gaze. The packs that fractured when the throne went unstable will come back when they see what fractured them. You will stand in front of every alpha and every noble house in this territory, and you will answer for what you arranged." Celine looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the specific grace of someone who understood when a position was untenable and refused to collapse ungracefully in it, she straightened and looked away first. The rogue wolves were bound. Celine's guard was disarmed. The eastern doors were secured. And the throne room of Dusk Hollow Palace held, in the cold hours before dawn, the evidence of what happened when arrangements built on other people's costs finally met the people who had paid them. The accounting took months. That was the part no one told you about. How long the aftermath was, how unglamorous, how much of rebuilding a fractured thing was the slow, unglamorous labor of showing up every day and doing the work that didn't announce itself. Kaelin summoned the fractured packs one by one and stood before them without the performance of invincibility and told them what had happened, and some came back and some did not. And the ones who did not were left to their declared independence without war, because Evelyn had told him, plainly and without argument, you don't rebuild loyalty with force. You rebuild it by being worth returning to. He had listened. That was the thing she had not predicted, how completely he had listened. Not in the way of a man making a strategic calculation about the value of appearing to listen. In the way of a man who had looked at the cost of not listening and found it totaled higher than he had the means to pay again. She did not make it easy for him. She had told him in the war room and she held to it. Her terms, her pace, the distance rebuilt at the rate she could trust it, rather than the rate he needed. There were weeks when she kept rooms between them and weeks when she did not, and he held to whatever she gave without pressing for more. And she watched him do it and understood what it cost a man like Kaelin to hold still when everything in him ran toward control. Understanding it did not obligate her to accelerate, but it went into the accounting. Lucien grew. He grew the way children grew when they were somewhere safe, fast, and full of himself, and completely indifferent to the politics of his existence. He walked at 9 months, which was early, and spoke his first word at 10, which was not Mama or any version of Kaelin's name, but was, emphatically, no, which Mira declared the most on-brand developmental milestone in the history of the royal bloodline. Kaelin spent hours with him, not the performative hours of a king acknowledging an heir, the actual hours of a man who had understood what he'd almost lost and was not going to perform gratitude from a distance when proximity was available. He sat on the floor of the nursery. He let the boy climb on him. He took the small hands that carried the current and held them without flinching, and Evelyn, watching from the doorway on a morning when the winter light came through the mountain window at the angle that made everything look like it was made of something worth keeping, felt the mate bond run its wire and did not press it down. She let it run. She had been pressing it down for a year. She understood why she had done it, and she did not regret it, and she was also very tired of it, and somewhere in the space between those two true things she found the room to let it be what it was. Kaelin looked up and found her in the doorway. He said nothing. He had learned in these months the difference between silence as avoidance and silence as something that could hold weight, and he was sitting in the weight of this one, morning light, his son's hands in his, the woman in the doorway who had built herself into someone he did not have the right words for yet. Lucien looked at her and said, "Mama, look." She looked at what he was showing her, which was a small stone he'd found somewhere and was offering with the urgency of someone who had discovered treasure. She crossed the room and crouched and took the stone and examined it with the seriousness it deserved. Kaelin was watching her. She felt it the way she always felt his attention, with her whole body, the unavoidable physics of proximity to something that had been part of your fundamental architecture for years. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He had rehearsed this. She could see the rehearsal in his face, the careful preparation of a man who understood that the wrong words in the wrong order would cost him the only thing he was still trying to get right. He was 40 years old and he had ruled a kingdom and fought a war, and she had watched him address 400 warriors without a tremor. And he was looking at her right now with the specific expression of a man for whom this was harder than all of it. Good, some part of her thought. Not cruelly, honestly. It should be hard. The things worth having should be hard. "I don't have a version of an apology," he said, "that's big enough for what I did." She held his gaze and waited. "I know that," he said. I'm not going to insult you by trying to make one word sized. He looked at his son, briefly, and back at her. What I have is every day. Whatever that's worth. I know what it's worth right now, which is not much, and I know what I'm asking you to let me try to build it toward. He stopped. The jaw. The controlled stillness. I'm asking. She looked at this man she had loved and survived and rebuilt herself in the aftermath of, and she felt the weight of what he was asking, not for forgiveness handed over clean and complete, but for the opportunity to earn something, incrementally, in the only currency that could not be faked. Time. Presence. Showing up. She had spent a year learning what showing up looked like when the only one you were accountable to was yourself and a child and a pack of northern wolves who owed you nothing. She knew the cost of it. She knew it was the hardest kind of work because it had no single moment of completion, no ceremony where you could declare it done. She also knew it was the only kind that held. You don't get the title back first, she said. You don't get to stand beside the throne and call me Luna and have that mean what you want it to mean. She kept her voice level. You earn the right to call me that by what you do with the days, not what you say about them. Yes, he said. And when Lucian is old enough to ask what happened, she said, you tell him the truth. All of it. A muscle in his jaw. That one cost him. She watched it cost him, and did not flinch from watching, because he needed to know she would not protect him from the accounting. Yes. And you understand, she said, and her voice dropped to something quieter and more final, that I'm not the woman who left. That woman had more patience for silence than I have now. What I am is what I made myself into out there, and it is not easier to be in a room with. She held his gaze. That's what you're asking to be in a life with. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking. Lucian put the stone in her hand and then immediately tried to take it back, and she let him have it, and the morning light held them all in it, without opinion. The new moon crown ceremony was held 2 years later, at the end of the second winter, when the fractured pacts had mostly returned and the rogue alliance had been dismantled at its roots, and the capital had stopped looking like a thing in the process of collapse, and had started looking like a thing choosing what to become. Evelyn had not planned the ceremony. That detail mattered to her. She had not engineered it, had not told Kaelin it was time, had not constructed the occasion out of a need for vindication. It had come from Aldrich, old Aldrich, gray-bearded and implacable, who had performed 4 ceremonies and outlasted the consequences of all of them, who had told Kaelin quietly that the kingdom needed to see what was standing, and what was standing needed to be named. She wore gray. Not the ash gray of the gown she'd worn on the night everything ended, but a different gray. Darker, heavier, the gray of mountain stone, the gray of the iron veil walls that had held her when she had nothing else to hold on to. She wore it because it was the color of what had built her, and she was not going to stand before 400 wolves in a costume that pretended the intervening years had not happened. The hall was full. Every pack that had come back, and several that had come back and brought others with them, and the nobles who had stood in silence on the night of the first ceremony, and were standing now with something different in their faces. Not excitement, solemnity. The kind of attention you brought to something that had cost the room more than it wanted to admit. Lucian stood beside her, 2 years and 2 months old, and he stood still with the preternatural patience of a child who had been born knowing he was waiting for something he would eventually grow into. He held her hand and looked out at the hall with his father's jaw and her eyes, and the current running underneath his skin that even now, at this age, made the wolves nearest to him stand a fraction straighter without knowing why. Aldrich began. Kaelin did not wait for the formal step. He turned to her before the words were finished, and he went to one knee in front of her. Not the formal knee of ceremony, not the posture of protocol, but the actual, weight-bearing kneel of a man setting down everything he'd been carrying in his hands and placing it on the floor between them in full view of everyone in the room. He held the moon crown up. His face was open in a way she had seen it be only in the darkest and quietest moments of the last 2 years, in the rooms where no one was watching and there was nothing to perform. That unguarded quality, the Kaelin underneath the alpha, the man she had loved before she'd understood what loving him would cost her. I know what this is worth, he said. His voice carried the way it always carried, but the register was different. Not authority, but honesty, which was its own kind of authority. I know what I took from you in this room, and I know I can't give it back. What I can do is stand in front of every witness in this kingdom and tell them what I know now. He held her gaze. That the strongest thing in this hall tonight is not me. It never was. The room was absolutely still. She looked at the crown in his hands, the circlet of silver and darkwood, the old markings, the weight that had never been about the metal. She looked at Kaelin's face, at the man who had broken her publicly and completely, and had spent 2 years learning what breaking something actually cost. She thought about the mountain road, the stone walls of the Iron Veil, Vanna's water-blue eyes and Mira's pragmatic grace, and Rael's almost smile in the dark. She thought about the copper basin and the second pulse and the moment on a cold floor in a palace corridor when she had pressed her forehead to the stone and breathed and decided that disappearing was not the same as surrendering. She thought about what it had taken to come back. Not the logistics, the decision. The choice to return not as a supplicant and not as a conqueror, but as exactly what she was, a woman who had walked out with nothing except the future in her body and had built enough with her own hands that walking back in was not need, but election. You did not arrive at that kind of standing through victory. You arrived through every day you chose to remain yourself when remaining yourself was the hardest available option. She reached out and took the crown from his hands. She held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, the actual physical weight, which was not heavy, had never been heavy, the lightness of it, always the first surprise. And she looked at it with the clear eyes of a woman who no longer needed it to define her. Then she placed it on her own head. The crowd did not erupt. It was not that kind of moment. What moved through the hall was something older and quieter, a sound like tide coming in. The long exhale of a room that had been holding its breath for 2 years, the sound of witness completing itself. Kaelin rose. He stood beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. And she felt the mate bond align the way it had not aligned in years, warm and certain and no longer a signal of debt or loss, but simply a fact of what they were. The way gravity was a fact. The way north was a fact. Lucian reached up and took her hand with his free one, and with the other he held Kaelin's, and the three of them stood before the kingdom they were going to build together. Not the kingdom that had been, not the thing that had fractured and burned and nearly destroyed itself from the inside, but the thing they were going to make from what remained, which was neither pristine nor simple but was real and earned and theirs. Outside the palace walls, the mountain air was cold and clean and entirely indifferent, the way it had been on the night she'd ridden north with nothing, and the way it would be after all of them were gone. The mountains did not care about crowns or ceremonies or the complicated human mathematics of love and damage and repair. But inside the hall, in the torchlight, with her son's hand in hers and the crown on her head and the kingdom watching, Evelyn Ashford stood in the exact center of everything she had built from the rubble of everything she had lost. And she was not grateful for the suffering that had made her, because suffering was not a gift, and she was not going to perform that particular lie. What she was, she decided, in the quiet of her own chest where no one else could hear it, was complete, not finished, not safe, not without the capacity for further damage or further joy. She had learned enough to know the two were never fully separated, complete. Present in herself in a way she had not been before the mountain road and the cold and the year of building something out of nothing, because you did not discover the full dimensions of what you were made of until you were required to use all of it. The crowd roared, and the curse that had haunted the throne of Dusk Hollow for 6 years broke without ceremony, in the way that all real things ended, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, permanent settling of something that had finally found its ground.